You are listening to File oh 07. Now, put on your headphones, turn off the lights, and brace yourself for terror.
I never believed in coincidences, but that night changed everything. It wasn't just the scent of fresh rain lingering in the air. There was something else, something unsettling and inexplicable. I stood at the edge of the cliff the locals called the end of the world, staring down at the city below when my phone rang. "Detective Cardona," I answered, my voice heavy with the exhaustion of a week without proper sleep. On the other end, a trembling voice. It was Lucas, the boy who worked at the corner store, always quiet, always keeping to himself. "I saw something, Detective. Something I wasn't supposed to see." His tone wasn't that of a kid playing a prank. He was terrified. "Calm down, kid. Where are you?" He hesitated, the silence on the line nearly deafening. "At the old house, you know. The one by the lake. You need to come. Now." Before I could respond, the line went dead. The house by the lake was a place people avoided partly out of superstition, partly out of good sense. Abandoned for decades, it was the backdrop to countless stories about disappearances and worse. I should have called for backup, but something in Lucas's voice pushed me forward. I grabbed my car keys and drove out there, my mind racing to connect the dots. Lucas wasn't the kind to get into trouble. What was he doing there? When I arrived, the rain had started, the sound of droplets on the house's rusted roof forming a gloomy symphony. I pushed the door open, and it gave way with a creak that felt more like a warning. The living room was empty, except for furniture draped in white sheets, and the air carried the smell of rotting wood mixed with something sickly sweet. "Lucas?" my voice echoed, but there was no reply. I climbed the stairs, each step creaking beneath my weight. I found the boy in the back room, pressed against the wall, his eyes wide and locked on something on the floor. "Lucas, what happened?" I asked, but he didn't answer. He just pointed. I followed his gaze and saw a red, leather-bound notebook, old and worn. As I crouched to pick it up, I felt the weight of something more than just paper. It was as if the object exuded a presence, something that made me hesitate before opening it. The pages were filled with scribbles and scattered notes, but one phrase appeared over and over. "She always knows where you are." "Who wrote this, Lucas?" I asked. He finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know, but I think they're coming." The bedroom door slammed shut suddenly, making me spin around with my gun drawn. There was no one there, just the faint sound of footsteps, impossible to trace. I looked back at Lucas, but he seemed even more terrified than I was. "You need to get out of here, kid," I ordered. But before I could give more instructions, we heard it. A laugh, faint, feminine, coming from nowhere and everywhere all at once. "What was that?" I asked. But Lucas was already running, and I was left there, alone, with a notebook in my hands and the sound of that laughter echoing off the walls. Little did I know that notebook would mark the start of the strangest and most terrifying case of my career, a case that would make me question everything I thought I knew about the world and about myself. The silence after the laughter was more unsettling than the sound itself. I held the notebook tightly, as if it were my only connection to reality at that moment. The house seemed to breathe, as though I wasn't alone. Taking a deep breath, I made my way outside, but each step felt heavier than the last. Lucas had vanished before I could catch up to him. He ran as if something were chasing him, yet there were no footprints in the mud outside. Strange, considering the rain showed no sign of letting up. I returned to my car, the notebook still in my hands. The leather cover was rough, and there was an almost invisible mark etched into the lower corner, a circular figure with a strange symbol in the center. It seemed older than the house itself, but what unsettled me the most was the feeling of being watched, the kind of sensation that makes the hairs on the back of your neck stand on end, like something is just waiting for you to make the mistake of turning around. Back at the station, I tried convincing myself this was just another case. There was a rational explanation. There always is. Yet at that moment, everything seemed to align with something I couldn't comprehend. I opened the notebook again under the yellow glow of my desk lamp. The pages were filled with drawings, faceless figures, spiraling lines, and interwoven circles. At the bottom of each page, the same phrase appeared. "She always knows where you are." "Boss?" My partner Ethan's voice broke my thoughts. He stood at the door, holding a cup of coffee and looking at me like I'd lost my mind. "You okay? You look like you've seen a ghost?" "I am fine, just analyzing a clue," I replied, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "Lucas was here earlier," he said, setting the coffee on my desk. "Wanted to talk to you but bolted before I could ask what it was about." "Lucas?" I frowned. "Why would he come here and then call me to that house? That doesn't make sense." Ethan scratched his head. "Maybe he's mixed up in something he shouldn't be. Kids around here love messing with things they don't understand." I nodded, but the conversation didn't put me at ease. The thought of Lucas playing with forces beyond his control seemed plausible, but his voice on the phone wasn't someone seeking thrills. It was someone terrified. I decided to investigate the house further. The next day, I returned in daylight, thinking the sunlight might dispel the unease. It didn't. The feeling of being watched was even stronger. I searched each room carefully, looking for any clues. In the basement, I found something out of place, a wooden box sealed with a rusted lock, the kind of object that looked like it had been sitting there for decades. I broke the lock with effort, using my service knife. Inside were photographs, old photos, all of the same woman. She stood, smiling faintly, but there was something unsettling in her eyes. Each picture had a note on the back, "Always watching." As I left the basement, the air grew heavier. What had been an uncomfortable silence turned into something almost tangible, like the entire atmosphere was conspiring against me. The door I had left open was now shut, and the sound of footsteps echoed from upstairs. I wasn't alone anymore. I climbed the stairs with my gun drawn, each creak of the steps announcing my approach. The footsteps stopped as I reached the top. The door to the back room was slightly ajar. I pushed it open cautiously. The notebook lay there on the floor, right where Lucas had left it. But now, a single word was written on the wall above it, in what looked like black ink. "Stay." Why I didn't leave right then, I can't say. Something inside me needed to understand what was happening, even if the answer cost me my sanity. I picked up the notebook again and flipped through the pages. At the very end, there was a new page that hadn't been there before. It had a date. Tomorrow? The date. It was tomorrow. It felt like a premonition. But I didn't believe in coincidences, let alone supernatural messages. I closed the notebook, trying to shake off the unease that had settled like a weight on my chest. Still, curiosity, or maybe something deeper, kept pushing me forward. Back at the station, I decided to share what I'd found with Ethan. He was skeptical to his core, his disbelief often balancing out my tendency to look for meaning in everything. But this time, he seemed different. "These photos," he said, holding one carefully. "I've seen her before." "You know her?" I asked, surprised. Ethan hesitated. "Not personally, but I've seen her. She was famous around here years ago before she disappeared. People say she was murdered, but her body was never found." "What do you mean? Who is she?" "Margaret Delaney," he replied grimly. "The owner of that house." A chill ran down my spine. "Are you saying the house I investigated belongs to someone who vanished? Why isn't this in the records?" "Because the case was filed as abandonment," Ethan said, still staring at the photo. "Nobody knew for sure what happened, just rumors that she was involved in something dangerous. Not exactly the reassurance I was looking for. I decided to do what any cop would, dig deeper. Hours of combing through old records finally led me to a forgotten report dated 20 years ago. The document described a string of disappearances tied to that house. All the missing people had one thing in common: they'd found something inside before vanishing. An unspecified object. It was late at night when I finally closed the files. The station phone rang, slicing through the silence like a blade. I picked it up, used to late-night calls. But this time, the voice on the other end froze me. "Detective, you still have the notebook, don't you?" It was a woman's voice, low, raspy. "Who is this?" I asked, masking the tension in my voice. "Return it, before it's too late." "Return it where? And who are you?" The line went dead before I could get any answers. I looked at the notebook sitting on my desk. It was just an object, right? A collection of pages and ink. But the sense that I was dealing with something far bigger than it seemed loomed like a shadow. The next day, I followed my instincts and returned to the house. The storm had passed, but the sky was overcast, as if the weather itself mirrored the tension of the place. Inside, the air felt heavier than before. Every room seemed to hold a story, a memory frozen in time. Upstairs, I found a mirror covered by a cloth. When I pulled the fabric away, I took a step back. My reflection was there, but behind me stood a pale, motionless figure of a woman. I spun around, but no one was there. The only thing left was a message scrawled on the fogged glass. "You shouldn't be here." That's when I heard it again, the sound of movement in the basement. Against all common sense, I went down. The lock I had broken was intact again, the box sealed. But this time, there was something else. Lucas. He stood in the corner, eyes wide and glassy, like he was seeing something I couldn't. "Lucas," I called, my voice steady despite the panic clawing at me. "What are you doing here?" "She's here," he whispered, unmoving. She never left. Before I could respond, the lights flickered, plunging the basement into an oppressive darkness. When the light returned, Lucas was gone. But the notebook. The notebook was now in the center of the floor, open to a new page. And my name was written on it. My name, scrawled in red ink, seemed to throb on the notebook's page like a living warning. I snapped it shut and gripped it tighter than I intended. Lucas had vanished before my very eyes, and I couldn't rationalize what I had just witnessed. Every instinct I had as a cop screamed for me to leave, but something stronger a pull perhaps kept me in the basement. I took a deep breath and scanned every shadowed corner of the space. The atmosphere was thick, as if the air carried ancient memories. That's when I noticed a detail I had overlooked before. Scratches on the floor, like those made by human nails. They started near the box and led toward the opposite wall. Something was there, hidden behind a metal shelf. Shoving it aside revealed a low, nearly invisible door with a rusted lock. It looked as though it hadn't been opened in decades. I stood there, questioning the sanity of going any further. But the memory of Lucas disappearing before my eyes forced me to act. Using the crowbar I kept in my car, I broke the lock and pushed the door open. A foul, ancient stench assaulted my senses. The space beyond was narrow and dimly lit, but at the far end, something glimmered. A silver object, partially buried in the dirt. I approached cautiously, feeling the weight of my own breath. It was a medallion, but there was something off about it. It seemed to pulse, almost as if it were alive. I picked it up hesitantly, and as I did, a wave of cold shot through my body. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind me, and a low, feminine laugh echoed through the space. "You shouldn't have touched that," said the same voice from the phone call. "Who are you? What do you want?" I shouted, swinging my flashlight to illuminate the room. But the only reply was the sound of hurried footsteps and a whisper. "You open the door. There's no going back now." The light flickered, plunging me into total darkness. I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to regain my composure. When I opened them again, the door was ajar, and the medallion, now warm in my hand, seemed to whisper incomprehensible words. I climbed out of the basement with my heart pounding, determined to leave the house, but was met with an even stranger sight. The living room, once filled with dust and decay, was now pristine, as if restored to its former glory. Soft music played in the background, and the scent of freshly baked bread filled the air. Then I realized I wasn't alone. A woman sat on the couch, dressed in period clothing, her smile unnervingly out of place. "Oh, you've arrived," she said casually. "I thought you'd never find the medallion." "Who are you?" I asked, keeping a safe distance. "Margaret," she replied calmly, "and you've brought me something that belongs to me." I looked down at the medallion in my hand, its weight feeling more pronounced than before. "I just want answers," I said, trying to steady my voice. She smiled, but there was something sinister in her expression. "Answers come at a price, detective, and you are more involved in this than you realize." "Lucas, where is he?" "Lucas made his choice," she said, rising slowly. "Just as you will make yours." The ground seemed to tremble, and the world around me began to warp, as if I were losing all sense of time and space. The walls of the house dissolved, revealing an endless void. Margaret, or whatever, she was stepped closer. "You don't understand, do you?" she whispered. "It's not the house. It's not the medallion. It's you. It's always been you." And then, everything went dark. I woke up in my car, my body heavy as if I had slept for days. The medallion was still in my hand, but the house, it was gone. The land, once occupied by the decaying mansion, was now just an empty field surrounded by gnarled trees. Confusion and panic consumed me. What was happening? I looked around, trying to piece together how I ended up there. The clock on the dashboard read 4:13 a.m., though I was sure it had been close to 10 p.m. when I entered the house. A thin layer of frost covered the windshield, something impossible for this time of year. I turned on the heater, struggling to process what I had seen and, most of all, what I had heard. "You don't understand. It's always been you." Margaret's voice echoed in my mind like a distorted lullaby. I decided I needed help. There was no one I could trust more than Olivia. I grabbed my phone, but of course, there was no signal. I resolved to drive back to the station, even though my mind was clouded with uncertainty. The medallion on the passenger seat seemed to vibrate with a life of its own, radiating an unsettling warmth. When I arrived at the station, the sense of normalcy brought temporary relief. The fluorescent lights flickered as usual, the smell of stale coffee filled the air, and Olivia's familiar voice called out from the records room. "Will, where the hell have you been?" "Olivia, you need to listen," I said, clutching the medallion tightly. "Something's wrong. Very wrong." She raised an eyebrow, crossing her arms. "Wrong is an understatement. You've been missing for 2 days. Lucas is still gone, and now you show up looking like you've seen a ghost?" "2 days?" I stammered. "I've only been gone a few hours at most." Olivia let out a heavy sigh. "Listen, Will, the Lucas case is getting messy. They found his car, but there's no sign of him. And one more thing." She hesitated, as if carefully choosing her words. "The place where you said he disappeared, there's no house there, just an empty field." Her words sent a chill down my spine. I showed her the medallion, trying to explain what had happened in the house. Her expression shifted from skepticism to genuine concern as I recounted the events. When I mentioned Margaret and her cryptic words, Olivia took the medallion, examining it closely. "This is old," she murmured, almost to herself. "Runes. Looks Nordic, but I can't be sure. I'll need to look into it." Suddenly, the medallion emitted a low sound, like a distant wail, and Olivia dropped it to the floor. "What the hell was that?" she exclaimed, stepping back. "That's what I am trying to figure out," I replied. "But there's more." Margaret said, "It's always been you." "What does that mean? I've never been to that place before." Olivia took a deep breath, trying to process everything. "Okay, we're going to handle this the right way. I'll take the medallion for analysis, and you are going home to get some rest. It's clear you are not thinking straight." Reluctantly, I agreed. I was exhausted, and the thought of sleep was tempting, even if my subconscious was already haunted by disturbing images. I drove to my apartment, but deep down, I knew the night was far from over. As soon as I walked in, I felt an odd sense of unease. Everything was exactly as I had left it, except for one detail: a framed photo on the shelf. It was a picture of me, taken years ago during an important investigation. But something was wrong. In the background of the photo, I could swear I saw Margaret's face, staring directly at me. I swallowed hard, feeling the weight of the medallion in my pocket. "Who are you?" I muttered into the emptiness. And as if in answer, the phone rang. I answered the phone with trembling hands, a mix of apprehension and curiosity pounding in my chest. The line crackled with static, but soon I heard a deep breath on the other end. Before I could say anything, a voice whispered, low and raspy, "You shouldn't have taken the medallion." The message froze my blood. "Who are you? What do you want?" I asked, trying to steady my voice, though the panic was obvious. "It's not about what I want, Will," the voice replied, slow and laden with an eerie calm. "It's about what you want, the truth." The call disconnected. I stared at the phone, my heart hammering against my ribs. That voice, it wasn't unfamiliar. There was something unsettlingly familiar about it, but I couldn't place where I'd heard it before. I sat on the edge of the bed, trying to piece things together. The medallion sat on the nightstand, pulsing with a faint glow that seemed to mock me. I picked it up hesitantly, feeling the strange warmth emanating from it. The runes etched into its surface appeared to shift as I stared at them. Closing my eyes, I tried to block out thoughts of Margaret and that desolate field, but an image forced its way into my mind. an ancient, ornate door surrounded by darkness. "You need to sleep, Will," I muttered to myself, dropping the medallion as if it burned my skin. I stepped into the shower, letting the hot water run over me, hoping to ease the tension. But it didn't take long for a peculiar sound to catch my attention, a faint tapping on the bathroom door. "Olivia," I called out, clinging to the irrational hope that she had shown up unannounced. No answer. I stepped out of the shower, water dripping onto the floor, and peeked into the hallway. It was empty. Every shadow seemed deeper, heavier, as if the house itself was conspiring against me. When I returned to the bedroom, something was off. The medallion was no longer on the nightstand. I searched frantically, checking every corner, but it was nowhere to be found. Finally, I turned around, and my reflection stared back at me from the mirror with a smile that wasn't on my face. "Leave me alone," I shouted, hurling a lamp at the mirror. It shattered into 1,000 pieces. In the deafening silence that followed, I heard something from the living room, footsteps slow, deliberate. I grabbed my gun from the closet and descended the stairs cautiously, each step creaking under my weight. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice wavering between authority and fear. No response, but the footsteps grew louder, closer. When I reached the living room, I saw a figure standing by the window. Moonlight illuminated part of their face, revealing a disturbing smile. "Margaret," I whispered. She tilted her head, her eyes glinting with an unnatural malevolence. "You are starting to understand, Will, but there's still so much to uncover." Before I could react, she vanished like a mirage. Left behind in her place was the medallion, back in my hand, with a new marking etched onto its surface, a door identical to the one I had seen in my mind. I knew I had to act. I couldn't keep running from the truth, whatever it was. Grabbing my keys, I bolted for the car. There was a place I needed to go, a place my mind had buried but was now clawing its way back to the surface, the house where I grew up. The road leading to my childhood home was winding, flanked by tall trees whose shadows intertwined under the moonlight. It felt like driving through a tunnel that led straight to memories I had spent my entire life trying to bury. Each mile grew heavier, as though the air around me thickened, and the darkness itself took on a tangible form. When I parked in front of the house, my heart skipped a beat. There it was, the faded facade worn by time, windows dull like tired eyes, and the old swing in the yard still swaying gently in the wind. A shiver of déjà vu ran down my spine. It was as if I had lived this moment before. Clutching the medallion tightly in my hand, I took a deep breath and stepped forward. Every step on the wooden porch creaked, the sound reverberating inside me. When I touched the doorknob, it gave way easily, creaking with a sound that brought back memories of nights I used to sneak out into the yard. The house was untouched, as if time had frozen the moment I left. The photographs on the walls stared back at me, frozen eyes in faded frames. My parents, my younger sister, and me, all smiling, as if nothing could ever harm us. But beneath that facade of happiness, I knew the truth was much darker. I went straight to the basement. That's where I needed to be. That's where it had all begun. Descending those stairs felt like plunging into an endless abyss. The flashlight on my phone illuminated the steps, revealing layers of dust and the scars of time etched into the wood. When I reached the bottom, I stood before the old iron door. My father always said the basement was off limits. He never explained why, but I knew something was wrong with that space. One night, when I was 9, my curiosity got the better of me. I snuck down while everyone was asleep, but what I saw beyond that door has haunted me ever since. Now, with the medallion pulsing in my hand, the door seemed almost alive. I touched its cold surface, and it opened with a deep groan, like a lament. The smell of dampness and mildew filled the air, and my flashlight revealed a room that seemed larger than I remembered. In the center stood a chair, a simple wooden chair, but its legs were bolted to the floor, as if it were meant to stay in place. Strange symbols were etched into the concrete around it, forming a perfect circle. Suddenly, the medallion grew so hot that I nearly dropped it. Its light intensified, flooding the room. That's when I saw her. A figure, small and frail, sitting in the chair. "It can't be," I murmured. my voice barely audible. It was Margaret. But something was wrong. Her eyes were open, fixed on me, but her expression was one of pure despair. "You took too long," she whispered, her voice weak, almost inaudible. Before I could ask what was happening, the medallion's light flickered violently, and a wave of energy rippled through the room. The walls seemed to breathe, pulsating as if made of flesh. Footsteps echoed in the basement, and a shadow crossed the doorway. "You were never supposed to come back here, Will," said a deep voice, emanating from all directions at once. It was my father. My body froze the moment I heard that voice. It was impossible. My father had been dead for over 20 years, and yet there he was, or rather, something that sounded like him. A dense shadow with indistinct contours began to take shape at the top of the stairs. "Dad?" My voice came out as a broken whisper, as distant as I felt from reality at that moment. "You were never supposed to meddle with this, Will. You should have never come back here." The tone was laden with a dark authority, but also with a weariness that seemed to weigh on every word. It wasn't the warm voice I remembered from bedtime stories. This was cold, hollow, almost metallic. "Why are you here? What is all of this?" I shouted, trying to suppress the panic threatening to consume me. The medallion pulsed again, almost as if it was trying to respond. The light emanating from it seemed to form a fragile barrier between me and the shadowy figure. Margaret, still in the chair, began murmuring something I couldn't make out. "You never realized, did you?" The shadow laughed a dry, humorless sound. "Always curious, but never observant. Always chasing answers, but blind to the ones right in front of you." My mind spiraled into a whirlwind of thoughts. I tried to focus on Margaret's words, crouching down to hear her. "He's trapped here. Trapped with them, because of you," she said, her eyes brimming with tears. "Me? What did I do?" I asked, my voice trembling. The shadow took a step forward, and I instinctively stepped back. "You disrupted the balance, Will. When you opened that door all those years ago, you let something out. Something that was never meant to see the light of day." Childhood memories struck me like lightning. That night in the basement, the circle on the floor, the strange symbols, and the noise. A low, guttural sound that seemed to echo inside my head. I remembered how my father found me there, eyes wide with terror, and dragged me back upstairs without saying a word. "I was just a kid," I screamed. "A kid who condemned us all," the shadow replied, now so close I could feel the icy air around it. Margaret tried to stand, but invisible chains bound her to the chair. "He's not your father anymore, Will. He's just a fragment of what was left behind. But there's something worse here. Something that has never stopped watching us. Stop this. Just explain it already." My patience was unraveling, tangled with the growing dread. The medallion flared brightly, and the shadow seemed to shrink, as if struck by an unseen force. That's when I realized the medallion was the key, but also the curse. "It belongs to him," Margaret said, pointing to the medallion. "It's the only thing that can stop him, but it can also set him free." "What is he?" I asked, but before she could answer, the sound of footsteps echoed again. This time, they came from everywhere, all at once. The shadow vanished in an instant, but the air grew heavy, suffused with the metallic scent of blood. "They're here," Margaret whispered, her eyes wide with terror. A laugh, low, cruel, spread through the room. It felt as though the basement itself was mocking us. I looked down at the medallion, and for the first time, I noticed the symbols etched into its surface. They were identical to those on the floor. Suddenly, a searing pain tore through my chest. It felt like something was trying to claw its way out of me. I collapsed to my knees, gasping for breath, as the medallion's light pulsed faster and faster. "Will, you have to decide," Margaret cried out, her voice laced with desperation. The choice loomed before me, as stark as the darkness enveloping us. Destroy the medallion and risk unleashing something far worse, or use it to banish these forces, perhaps at the cost of my own sanity. The cold in the basement seemed to intensify with each passing second, as if something unseen was draining the warmth from the room, and along with it, my resolve. Margaret remained trapped in the chair, murmuring words I could barely make out, while the shadows around us began to take on more defined shapes. They weren't human. They never had been. "Do you feel it, Will?" Margaret's voice cut through the silence, urgent, almost frantic. "They're waiting for your decision. The choice isn't just yours. It's for everyone who came before and everyone who will come after." I gripped the medallion tighter, its pulsating heat searing into my skin. My heart pounded in my chest like a wild drum. What if I am wrong? What if I make it worse? There's no time for doubt, Margaret said, her voice firm with the determination I had never seen in her before. What you saw wasn't a dream, nor a nightmare. It was a warning. The memory of that circle in the basement returned with greater intensity, vivid and unrelenting. I remembered symbols drawn in charcoal, a candle burning with a bluish flame, and a tall hooded figure standing in the darkest corner. That night, everything changed. But until now, I hadn't grasped the magnitude of it. You opened the door and saw what you shouldn't have, whispered one of the shadows, its voice like the sound of stones being ground together. But why me? What do they want from me? My voice was a mixture of anger and despair. Because you are the link, Margaret replied. Your family did this before you. You are just the latest to bear this curse. I stared at her, confused. What curse? The medallion. It keeps the balance between what's trapped and what could escape. But using it always comes at a cost. The shadows began to move faster now, circling the room like predators waiting for a misstep. The medallion's light seemed to hold them at bay, but only barely. They were testing its limits, and mine. Suddenly, a deep, resonant sound reverberated through the basement, as if something enormous was stirring far beneath us. It was a sound you didn't just hear, but felt in your chest, in your very bones. Time's up, Will, Margaret said, tears streaming down her face. Act now, or we'll all be consumed. I stood up, gasping for breath, the medallion heavy in my hand. My father's words echoed in my mind. Never meddle with what you don't understand. But it was too late for regrets. If I destroy it, what happens? I asked, my voice almost pleading for an answer. You seal what's here, but you also destroy the link, Margaret said. That's good, isn't it? Number without the link, nothing will stop them from coming back, and next time, no one will be here to stop them. The horror of it hit me like a punch to the gut. It was a no-win situation. Every choice led to destruction, one way or another. The shadows froze, as if waiting for my decision. My mind was spinning, every thought more tangled than the last. There was no time to plan, no time to think of alternatives. With a cry of desperation, I raised the medallion above my head, ready to decide the fate of all of us. And then the ground began to shake. The tremor intensified, making it impossible to keep my balance. I stumbled, falling to my knees, but I didn't let go of the medallion. Its vibrations seemed to pulse in sync with the shaking ground, and each pulse made the air around me grow heavier. It felt as if the house itself was alive, reacting to my hesitation. Margaret shouted something, but her voice was drowned out by the growing roar that seemed to emanate from the walls. The shadows stopped moving, frozen like grotesque statues. But their eyes, or what could pass as eyes, shone, fixed on me. You've already made your choice, Will. A deep, guttural voice echoed through the room. It wasn't Margaret, nor was it anything I could see. It was as though the basement itself was speaking. I haven't chosen anything yet, I shouted back, my throat dry, my breath ragged. But the choice was made for you, long before you were born. The words echoed in my mind, blending with fragmented memories I didn't know I had. My father, my grandfather, even distant figures dressed in ancient clothing, flashed before me like pieces of a shattered film reel. Each of them held the medallion. Each of them faced the same dilemma. Is this what you do? Pass this. Curse from one generation to the next? My voice carried more anger than fear now, though my hands trembled. Margaret, still bound to the chair, was quietly weeping. They had no choice, Will. Neither do you. That's a lie. The moment I shouted, the tremor stopped. The silence that followed was more terrifying than the chaos had been. The shadows retreated to the corners, but they still watched, their eyes or whatever they were gleaming with almost palpable anticipation. If you truly have no choice, why do you fight so hard against it? The guttural voice asked again, closer now, almost whispering in my ear. I spun around instinctively, but there was nothing there, only emptiness. Because I won't accept it, I shot back, trying to sound more resolute than I felt. Margaret raised her head, her eyes filled with despair and something else. Was it pity? Well, there are things you don't understand. The medallion isn't just a key, it's a bridge. Destroying it might save the present, but it will open a path to something far worse. Then what do you want me to do? I asked, exasperated, gripping the medallion so tightly it hurt my hand. "It's not about what I want. It's about what you can live with knowing." Her words carried a strange weight, as if they held a meaning I couldn't yet fully grasp. Then I saw it. On the floor beneath Margaret's feet, something began to take shape. It wasn't a shadow, but a light dim, pulsing, almost imperceptible. And then the memory came flooding back. That same light was there the night my father died. He had held the medallion, just as I was now, while the circle around him glowed with that same intensity. "You see it, don't you?" Margaret asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes," I replied, though the word came out trembling. "Then you know what you have to do." The light beneath Margaret's feet pulsed in a slow, hypnotic rhythm. It was both inviting and threatening, like an invitation to a secret no one should know. The medallion in my hands seemed to vibrate in response, tuned to the energy of that light. "You can break the cycle, Will," Margaret said, her voice carrying an urgency that made me shiver. "But there's a price." "Price?" My voice came out louder than I intended. "I've already lost my father. My life's been consumed by this cycle. What else could it cost?" Margaret looked away, unable to answer. The light began to spread, tracing shapes on the basement floor, like ancient runes carved in a lost language. They glowed, revealing a pattern that expanded to the center of the room. A figure began to form, translucent, but unmistakably human. "Dad?" The word escaped before I could think. The figure was tall, broad-shouldered, with the same dark eyes I remembered from the last time we said goodbye, but something was wrong. His expression was cold, empty, as if he were nothing more than a shadow of the man I knew. "It's not him, Will," Margaret whispered, her voice choked. "It's a projection, an illusion meant to manipulate you." "But what if it was him? What if?" The figure stepped forward, and the heat from the medallion in my hand intensified. It was unbearable, as if trying to warn or punish me. "Will," the figure called, its voice so much like my father's that it made my heart ache. "You don't have to do this. You don't need to carry this burden." "Why not?" I asked, the words coming out in a sob. "Because it's not yours to carry," it replied. "I made mistakes, son. I made choices I paid dearly for, and you shouldn't have to suffer for them." The runes on the floor gleamed brighter, as if fighting for my attention. Margaret, now completely still, appeared trapped in some kind of trance. "If I don't do this," I murmured, as if talking to myself, "what happens?" The figure hesitated. That was enough for me to realize the truth. It wasn't my father. My father would never hesitate. He was a man of clear words and quick decisions. "You are not him," I said, with more conviction this time. The figure recoiled, its form flickering, almost like a flame fighting against the wind. The runes began to shift, forming a new pattern, and I knew I was running out of time. "Will," Margaret said, her voice now urgent, "choose. Either destroy the medallion and end it all, or use it to seal the portal again, but decide quickly." The heat from the medallion grew stronger, and the shadows on the walls began to move again. They stretched, forming shapes that resembled hands, as if trying to reach for something or someone. My mind spun with confusion. What hadn't Margaret told me? What was the price of each choice? "Dad, help me!" But the figure vanished, dissolving like smoke. The decision was mine, and I knew no one could make it for me. The darkness swallowed the basement as soon as the figure vanished. The runes on the floor, which had been pulsing with an unsettling light, now flickered faintly, as if waiting for my decision. My heart pounded like a mismatched drum, and the heat from the medallion in my hand seemed to burn it raw. "Will, they're coming," Margaret murmured, barely audible. Her voice carried a tremor I'd never noticed before, as if even she was scared. "Who's coming?" I demanded, but my voice sounded more desperate than firm. "The ones who guard the portal." A low sound, like a guttural growl, reverberated through the room. I looked around, trying to pinpoint its source, but it seemed to come from all sides. The shadows on the walls began to take shape again, but this time they weren't just outstretched hands. They were faces. Faces twisted in expressions of agony, hatred, and despair. Margaret backed up against the far wall, her eyes fixed on the shadows. They don't want you to choose, she said, her voice barely a whisper. They want you to hesitate, to doubt. My hands were sweating so much, I almost dropped the medallion. The voices began, whispering my name first softly, then more insistently, until they became a deafening chorus. Will, you'll never be able. You'll fail. Shut up, I shouted, gripping the medallion so tightly my nails cut into the palm of my hand. The voices stopped abruptly, but the tension in the air remained. Margaret watched me, a mix of expectation and fear in her eyes. You need to decide now, she urged. Why didn't you tell me everything from the start? I asked, my tone accusatory. She didn't answer immediately, and when she did, her voice was laden with guilt. Because I knew you wouldn't have come if you'd known the real price. What's the price, Margaret? She swallowed hard, her eyes full of tears. If you destroy the medallion, the portal will be closed forever. But you'll be taken with it. The revelation hit me like a punch. I die? Margaret nodded, tears streaming down her face. But you save everyone else. The cycle ends. Then, what's the other option? Use the medallion to seal the portal temporarily, she whispered, her voice barely audible. But it will reopen. Not now, maybe not for decades, but someone will have to face it again. The weight of the decision was crushing. Sacrifice my life to end it once and for all? Or delay the inevitable, condemning someone else to the same fate? The shadows began to move closer, slowly, like predators closing in on their prey. I knew I had no more time to think. The medallion seemed to pulse, as if alive, as if waiting for my decision. I closed my eyes and let my father's words echo in my mind. You don't have to carry this burden. But maybe I did. Will, please? Margaret pleaded, her voice trembling. I took a deep breath, trying to find a calm that simply wasn't there. Then, with one last look at Margaret, I raised the medallion and made my choice. The moment I lifted the medallion, there was an absolute silence. It was as if even time had stopped to witness my decision. The runes on the floor glowed again, but this time in a blinding light, like a final warning. Margaret stood frozen, her eyes wide as I whispered the words I had read in the diary. The words echoed, a guttural and ancient sound that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside me. It was as if I had tapped into something beyond human understanding. Then, it happened. The medallion shone with an intensity almost unbearable, burning my palm. The shadows around me twisted, screaming but not with human voices. These were screams that pierced the mind, making my vision shake, nearly forcing me to drop everything. Margaret tried to rush toward me but was stopped, as if an invisible barrier separated her from me. Will, no, she shouted, but her voice seemed distant. I could feel the power of the medallion consuming me, as if it were draining everything I was, every memory, every emotion. Images of my life flashed before my eyes like a movie. My father, the case that changed my career, Margaret's smile when we first met, and yet none of it seemed to matter now. All that mattered was ending this. You can't win, a deep, grave voice murmured in my ear, so close it made me turn, but there was no one there. The shadows began to retreat, slithering back toward the portal, now pulsing like a monstrous heart. The ground trembled, and cracks spread like webs across the room. Margaret, I managed to murmur, my voice weak. If I don't come back, close everything. Don't let anyone in here. No, you need to get out, she shouted, tears streaming down her face. But I knew there was no other way out. The medallion began to suck in the energy around it, including mine. I felt my body weaken, every muscle giving way, each breath becoming a monumental effort. Suddenly, a deafening metallic sound echoed as the portal began to close, collapsing in on itself. But instead of disappearing, it expanded one last time, sucking everything in, including the light. I crashed to the ground, my hands and knees throbbing with pain. When I lifted my head, the medallion lay in pieces before me. Margaret rushed to my side, pulling me away from the circle. You did it, she whispered, almost incredulous. But something was wrong. The portal was closed, yes, but the environment was no longer the same. The basement looked different. almost distorted, as if we were in a twisted version of the same place. "Margaret," I said, gasping. "What is this?" She looked around, confused. "I don't know. This has never happened before." Before I could react, a figure emerged from the shadows. It wasn't like the ones I had seen before. It was tall, imposing, with eyes that seemed to reflect the very darkness itself. "You closed the portal," the figure said, its voice echoing inside my head, "but the cost has not yet been paid." Margaret stepped back, while I tried to rise, my legs shaking. "Who are you?" The figure smiled, but it was a hollow smile, devoid of warmth, someone who has come to claim what is owed. The air around the figure seemed to vibrate, a suffocating heat that contrasted with the supernatural cold that had dominated the basement until then. Its eyes, black as a starless sky, seemed to pierce my soul, searching for something I didn't even know I had. "I don't owe you anything," I murmured, my voice carrying a firmness that I didn't actually feel. Every fiber of my being screamed to run, but my legs remained frozen, as if rooted to the ground. The figure tilted its head, as if assessing prey. "The debt isn't just yours," it replied, its tone both enigmatic and condemning. Margaret stepped forward, gripping my arm. "Will, let's go. Now." Her voice was thick with emotion, her eyes locked on the figure in front of us. "It's useless," the figure whispered. "You are already inside. There's no such thing as leaving." The environment around us began to shift again. The cracked basement floor gave way to a distorted landscape. Walls stretching endlessly, doors appearing and disappearing in the blink of an eye. A sky that wasn't really a sky, but a vast grayness that made the mind waver just by looking at it. "Will," Margaret started, but her voice was swallowed by a distorted echo. The figure walked toward us, slow and deliberate, as if it had all the time in the world. "You tampered with something you don't understand. The portal was closed, but the cost of closing the portal is opening another." My hands clenched into fists instinctively, even though I knew it was pointless to fight. "If this is about the medallion, it's destroyed. There's nothing else you can do." "It's not about the medallion," the figure responded, almost with disdain. "It's about you. You touched the veil between worlds. You tore it." The words resonated within me, like thunder. I turned to Margaret, but she was as pale as marble, her eyes wide, fixed on something I couldn't see. "Margaret, what is it?" She pointed, unable to speak. When I turned, I saw we were no longer alone. Indistinct figures began to emerge from the walls, their bodies flickering like poorly tuned images on an old television. "They come to collect," the figure said, now sounding almost pleased. The figures had no faces, but there was something undeniably human about them. I could feel the pain, the anger, the desperation radiating from their translucent bodies. One of them approached, and when it tried to touch my arm, I felt a sharp pain that coursed through my body. "Will, don't let them touch you," Margaret shouted, pulling me away. The main figure watched it all with an expression bordering on boredom. "You two will be eternal now, trapped between worlds, like them. That's the price." But there was something in its tone that gave me a spark of hope. A word. "What if we pay another way?" The figure stopped, its black eyes narrowing. "Another way?" Margaret looked at me as if I were insane. "Will, what are you doing?" "I am talking to you," I murmured, trying to stay focused. "This is part of it, right? If there's a price, there must be a bargain." The figure tilted its head again, now intrigued. "Interesting. But be careful what you offer, detective. Every choice has a price." Margaret tried to pull me back. "Will, no, we can't trust them." I knew she was right, but at the same time, I knew we had no choice. I looked directly into the eyes of that thing. "Tell me what you want." The figure took a step forward, and the entire space around us seemed to hold its breath. "What do I want?" it repeated, almost savoring the words. "I want what you fear losing the most." My mind raced. Images collided. My life, my work, Margaret, my own sanity. It was a game, and I knew every word spoken would be used against me. "Will, don't play their game," Margaret pleaded, gripping my arm tightly. Here is always another way out." But I knew there wasn't. Not after everything we had done. Not after everything we had uncovered. I just needed to find the right piece, the one bargain that wouldn't cost me more than I could bear to lose. "We won't move until you tell us what you need to let us leave," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. The figure laughed, a dry, cavernous sound that echoed through that infinite void. "You want to leave? Very well." The landscape around us began to change again. The spectral figures disappeared, the distorted walls shrank, and suddenly we were back in the basement. The destroyed medallion lay on the floor between us. But something was wrong. The silence was unbearable, as if the very air was holding its breath, trying not to reveal a secret. "Will, are we really back?" Margaret asked, her voice low and hesitant. Before I could answer, the figure appeared again, this time closer, more human. "The choice is simple, detective. You or her." My heart skipped a beat. "What?" "Someone has to stay so the portal remains closed. Someone always stays." Margaret stepped forward, shaking her head. "Number, this isn't fair. You can't make us choose this." "Fair?" The figure smiled. "You opened the door. You brought this upon yourselves. Now pay the price." I turned to Margaret, my mind a storm of conflicting thoughts. There was no way out of this. One of us would have to stay. And as she stared at me with tears in her eyes, I realized she knew what I was thinking. "No, Will, you can't do this." "Margaret, I can't let you do this." "I can't let you do it either." The figure seemed to take pleasure in our dilemma. "You have 1 minute. Make your choice." My thoughts were in chaos. There was no solution that wasn't a sacrifice. Margaret had more to lose, more to live for. But at the same time, leaving her behind was something I could never carry. "Will, listen to me," she said, holding my face in her hands. "You have to leave. You need to keep going. Margaret, please. Do it for me," she pleaded, her voice filled with emotion. "You are stronger than you think. You can survive this." Before I could answer, Margaret turned to the figure. "I stay." "No," I shouted, but it was too late. The figure smiled, satisfied. "Then it's decided." And with that, the ground beneath Margaret's feet began to open. She looked at me one last time, tears streaming down her face, but with a smile that seemed both sad and full of peace. "Live, Will, for me." The light around us exploded in a blinding flash, and when I could open my eyes again, I was alone. The basement was empty. The destroyed medallion had vanished, and Margaret was gone. I fell to my knees, the weight of the choice crushing my chest. Warm tears streamed down my face as silence took over. But something inside me knew this wasn't the end, because even in the silence, I could still hear her voice. And so, everything I thought I knew about the world began to crumble before my eyes. The notebook, the inexplicable presence, the laughter. No logical explanation seemed to be enough for it. Luca's case, the abandoned house, this was only the beginning. And as I delved deeper into the shadows surrounding this mystery, one thing was clear. Something far darker was at play. Something that couldn't be ignored. If you are as intrigued as I am, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. The mystery has just begun, and you won't want to miss what's coming next. The terror continues. Until the next chapter.